My name is Kate. I'm a reporter here with the Charles City Press in town. Welcome to Cedar Talks. It's our free speaker series. I want to welcome Bennett Smith. He's come. He speaks as he's a professor with NIAC in Mason City and is also a speaker with their lifelong learning series. So I'm going to hand this over to him tonight, but just a reminder, there are note cards and pens in front of you. If you feel the need to take notes, if that helps you, have at it. So welcome to Bennett Smith.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to be here in Charles City. I haven't been over here for a little while. I grew up in Clear Lake, Iowa, so not far away. Used to go through here all the time on my way to Iowa City before the Avenue of the Saints was even here. So thank you again for the invitation. I also, as Kate said, I'm an instructor in history and political science at NIAC over in Mason City. So it was a quick run over this evening. And by the way, I've never ate here at Pub on the Cedar. I came over early to get some dinner. The hamburger and fries was fantastic. So I would recommend that. And I'm kind of a connoisseur of that, so as you might tell. So terrific place to eat. Okay, so what I'd like to do this evening as far as the program, of course, as you see, we want to talk about term limits, solution or symptom, meaning is it really the push for term limits? Is that a real issue that needs to be handled, or does it represent perhaps some other problems, deeper problems in the American body politic? So we'll talk about that tonight. Now what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you guys, is I've got a few slides I want to walk through, but I want to make this very interactive. So don't hesitate to raise your hand, ask a question. We're going to have a lot of discussion here. I saw the video from November where you had Dr. Larimer in. That was a great discussion that you guys had, so we'll look forward to it. Okay, just by way of preview, we're going to start tonight kind of defining what are term limits. We'll look at the history of term limits. Then I want to take a look at a Supreme Court case, U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, to kind of get a sense for the law in this area. And then what we'll do is look at some arguments, pro and con, and that's where I want to get all of your thoughts on what you think, if this would be a good thing to have for our National Congress or not. And then, again, the fundamental question I want to pose here is the push for term limits the solution to a political problem or a symptom of deeper political issues? How many of you follow politics on a regular basis? Excellent. How do you think it's going? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, we just came out of a government shutdown, right? We shut down for 3 days. So, you know, when you think about it, the question's going to be, would term limits ameliorate some of that dysfunction? We'll talk about that. All right, so let's define it first of all. What are term limits? Okay, a limit on the number of terms a member of Congress can serve, House or Senate. So for example, according to the Constitution, you get 2-year terms for the House, 6-year terms for the Senate, and of course a limit would impose either a consecutive or a lifetime limit on the number of terms a member of Congress could serve. So that's the general idea. And of course in the Constitution right now, the Article 1 requirements, and by the way, I'll let you do the pushing if you want to do that. Thank you. You can just, I'll look at you when I want you to advance. Thank you. So the Article 1 requirements in the Constitution. The first one, of course, go ahead, is there's an age requirement. Now, does anybody know what the age requirement is for the House?
35.
Not 35. Anybody want to guess? 25. Very good. How about the Senate? No, not 32, a little higher. 35, actually. So, no, I think it's, wait a minute, is it 35 or 30? Now you got me stumped. It might be 30 and 35 for the president. The reason I always forget this is I'd kind of like to bump them up about 5 years, you know what I mean? So, okay, the next one, a residency requirement, right? That's an Article 1 requirement. And then the third one, a citizenship requirement. So those are the constitutional qualifications for the term limit debate. Now, the issue the court has is that, these are actual constitutional qualifications. So the ultimate question is going to become, who can change those, right? So we'll look at that. All right, so where are term limits currently? Let's see if we've got any right now in the country. Of course, with states, cities, and political parties, we do have some form of term limits. The first one is going to be in the governor's offices. You've got 36 governors that are currently term limited, either, again, with a consecutive limit or a lifetime limit. 15 state legislatures currently have term limits on their own state legislators, all right? And then the third one, if you want to go one more here, is 8 of the largest cities in the country. For example, New York City has a term limit. Now that's an interesting case because Michael Bloomberg, you see in the picture here, when he bumped up against, or was going to bump up against that limit on his second term, convinced him to extend that to a third term. And so they changed the law in New York City. Subsequently, they changed it back, okay? But they had the power to do that. So, actually, go back one more if you would there, Kate. The link, let's see, can you bring up the link here for me? This is a good website I want to show you on term limits. There we go, thank you. I'm glad you know how to run that because I'm no computer genius. This is the National Conference of State Legislatures website. So if you scroll down, you can see these are the states that have actual term limits on their legislature, the year enacted, the limit, and so on, okay? All right, let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. There we go, thank you. So the point I want to make here, ladies and gentlemen, is we do have some term limits already with cities, governor's office, and state legislatures. Now keep in mind, the question's going to be, no, not in Iowa, but the question's going to be, are those effective? Have they been effective? The research is kind of mixed on that, okay? So, interesting story there. All right, so how about political party term limits? This is one in doing some of the research for this presentation that I looked at that was new to me, and that is, for example, the committee chairs in the House of Representatives, which is currently controlled by the Republicans, have term limits. They've got term limits for their committee chairman in the House. And again, wanting to promote some rotation and some new people in that. Now, let me ask, before she advances this, what do you think would be the concern about doing that? What would be a downside to doing that? What's that? They wouldn't know what they're talking about. Exactly, meaning a loss of expertise, right? That's a big deal as a committee chairperson. Now flip the other side, what would be an advantage to rotating people? the same issue, huh? Right, well, you'd get some fresh thinking in there, wouldn't you? You know, and some folks that are intractable in their view, you'd have some rotation. Now that word, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be very important in the history of this issue. The concept of rotation in office has a long history going back into our colonial history. Okay. So right now, for how the House Republicans have set it up, is you can do 3 terms for a total of 6 years as a chairperson, and then you're done, okay? Now, in this particular article I put in here, if you Google this in the Washington Post, it advocates the argument that it really is not particularly effective in this case to have term limits for committee chairmen, just because of the necessary expertise and experience that they get are very, very important. And I don't know about you, I tend to agree with that argument, that the issue of expertise and experience are very important factors in politics, okay? We'll see what you think when you get done eating here. So, all right. And there's the article, How Term Limits for Committee Chairs Make Congress Less Effective. At least from this author's vantage point, again, they're going to argue from their research that it lessens the effectiveness of a committee chairperson. Okay? Now, I'm just curious, how many of you think that experience and expertise matters in politics? Because this is kind of an interesting subject. What do you think? Okay, so you would suggest that we need experience and expertise. Well, I wasn't going to raise the issue, but I was going to get there eventually, all right? How about the rest of you, though? Is it important to you that a politician has experience and expertise about government and governing? Is that? Because we're experiencing kind of a wave right now where, again, with this most recent election, President Trump did not have any political experience. And a lot of people liked that, or at least enough people liked that, to get him over the top in the Electoral College. How do you think that's working, that lack of experience? I have to ask some loaded questions, don't I, Kate? You know, I mean, that's an interesting perspective, right? Same for the Congress, really. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. We'll look at a few other issues here. Okay, let's look at the history of term limits. So as I mentioned earlier, the whole concept of rotation in office, that word was very powerful to the founders because they viewed politics, and the central concept in politics is really power. The metaphor that they like to talk about was that power was a consuming fire. And then if you got too much of it, if too much of it was concentrated in too few hands, it would consume the liberties of the people, all right? So this was one of the reasons why I think they wanted to have a rotation in office to begin with. It's also, by the way, by the time we get to the Constitutional Convention, Madison is very adeptly looking at how do we divide and disperse power in our constitutional framework. But the idea of not having full-time, lifelong legislators, it really was not a big issue at this point because a lot of people, again, they believed in the concept of rotation on a voluntary basis. Now, interestingly, under the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, there was a limit on those that were part of that legislature. They could serve 6 years total, but they had to serve, I think it was only 3 out of the 6, okay? They couldn't do it consecutively. So there was a limit, in fact. But when we get to the Constitution, there is no limits embedded in there, of course, all right? And then, interestingly, just to use this example, Abraham Lincoln, 1846 to 1848, serves 1 term in Congress. He goes home and doesn't serve another term, in part because during the 19th century, and even the 18th as well, a lot of these folks believed in voluntary rotation. They did not believe that you should stay a long time or that you needed to stay a long time. They didn't view it as a career type of thing. And so it was kind of handled by the parties and the powers that be that you would rotate around. Now you might go from the House to the Senate or something like that, but Lincoln's a great example of that. And one of the great stories I love about Lincoln when he was in Congress was another congressman had somehow accused Lincoln of being two-faced on an issue. And of course, Lincoln responded, "If I had 2 faces, do you think I'd be using this one?" I feel the same way. So, so that was kind of Lincoln's view, right? So he rotates out. You probably know the rest of the story with Lincoln. And then in the 1990s, bringing this forward, the 1990s are really where we see the modern-day push for term limits and attempts in Congress to actually impose that. If you remember the 1994 Contract with America, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans promoted this issue. When they took over Congress, there was a couple attempts to do this. And then just one quote I want to reference to you, going back in our history to emphasize this idea of rotation. This is James Madison from Federalist 53. He says, "I shall here perhaps be reminded of a current observation that where annual elections end, tyranny begins. And they were very concerned about that. That phrase was not original with Madison. It went back much further even. Notice his rationale, though. He says, if it be true, as often been remarked, that sayings which become proverbial are generally founded in reason, it is not less true that when once established, they are often applied to cases to which the reason of them does not extend. I need not look for a proof beyond the case before us. What is the reason on which this proverbial observation is founded? No man will subject himself to the ridicule of pretending that any natural connection subsists between the sun or the seasons and the period within which the human virtue can bear the temptations of power. Okay? So you can see their rationale for thinking about this. Now, he also wants to think through, though, the downside to too much rotation. You know, a lot of the anti-federalists were really stunned by the fact that the senatorial term was 6 years. But they also wanted to promote that kind of stability so that you didn't have to worry about getting reelected every year, okay? And so you could emphasize long-term thinking, whether in the area of foreign relations or any other subject. So, interesting perspective from Madison. All right, so what I wanted to do here, ladies and gentlemen, just historically before we get to the Supreme Court case, is show you some of the themes back during the time of the constitutional ratification process that were present for Federalists and Anti-Federalists, all right? And the reason I want to do that is I think what we can discern here is actually some trends in our politics that are still with us today in the two political parties and different movements, like kind of the populism that's emerged today in our politics. So I'm going to have you just click all these through, and I'll just talk about each of them. There's another set on the other side there, Kate. There we go. Very good. Okay, so if you notice on the left side, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a comparison of Federalist versus Anti-Federalist thought. And on the left, again, Federalists tended to emphasize the idea of republicanism, meaning representative democracy. Anti-Federalists, more interested in direct democracy, closer to the people, as a kind of instinct. On the left, you see the idea of the filtering principle. This was Madison's idea in the Federalist, that with representation, there's kind of a filter that occurs where people will select the best and the brightest, so to speak, to represent them in the Congress. All right, so he viewed that whole process as a kind of filter, and that would be a positive. Okay, how do you think that's working today? So it's still working all right? Maybe not? Okay. Well, notice on the opposite side, let me kick over to the Anti-Federalists. People like Patrick Henry and others emphasized more the mirror theory of representation, meaning they were more concerned that their elected officials represent kind of the broad social economic classes of the people. And so notice, they are more in favor of annual elections, whereas Madison and the Federalists are more interested in the 2- and 6-year terms. All right? So my point here is that you see on the right versus the left, I think the Anti-Federalists would be more interested in this cause of term limits versus these other folks. Does that make sense? And again, it's very interesting to me because the strains of populism, whether from the far left or the far right, that kind of go through American politics and history, you can see them in both political parties, really, and that emphasize this at different points in our history. Okay, so let's go to the next one. This is really interesting to me because, of course, most of you know the story. Before 1951, there was no term limit on the presidency, right? George Washington sets a very powerful example in this regard. In fact, Kate, I'm going to have you click through to the next slide. We'll come back to this one. But this is the portrait of George Washington surrendering his commission at the end of the Revolutionary War at the old Maryland State House in Annapolis. And why this is so important, ladies and gentlemen, is because it's Washington giving up power. And that is a profound principle in any republic to make it work. It's not to aggregate power, to pursue power, it's the giving up of power. So Washington provides a powerful, powerful example in doing this. Okay, King George III said he'd be the most important man in the world if he did this. All right? And everybody was stunned because people that won revolutionary wars tended to not give up power. All right? Now, the reason I bring this up, ladies and gentlemen, is because what Washington will do then once he's elected president is voluntarily give it up after that second term. There was nothing that forced him to do that in the Constitution. In fact, the Anti-Federalists were concerned that Article 2 in the Constitution was too strong, too much resembled the monarchy that they had just come out from under. And the reason they were comfortable with that is they knew this guy would be the first person to become president. So how he handled that office was absolutely crucial. And his voluntarily giving up power after that second presidential term lasted until FDR. Now that is amazing. Now there's a couple people that wanted a third term. Does anybody know who that was? I have to give you a quiz. It's part of my DNA, right? Who ran for a third term? Turn of the century, think. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, right? TR. He got beat in that 1912 election with the Bull Moose Party. I think U.S. Grant maybe wanted a third term too. I can't quite remember. But everybody else, again, voluntarily giving up power, primarily as a result of the mere example of George Washington. So this is why I say when I mentioned the Lincoln example about voluntary rotation with the Congress, this is partly why they did that. This was part of the DNA of kind of the system. You weren't supposed to stay your whole life, okay? All right, let's go back to the prior slide if we could. So here, the Republicans come into power in 1947, and they pushed through this amendment, which did clear the states because I think the Southern Democratic states also went along with this. And FDR had 4 terms. He got elected 4 times, right? So that's the 22nd Amendment. Now, I pose the question, ladies and gentlemen, to you, balancing the branches, right? If they decided to impose a term limit on the executive branch, would it make sense to you to impose it on the legislative branch? Or should we take it off of the executive? What do you think? You see, the founders, at least, didn't have a term limit on either one. What do you think? Any ideas on that? You'd rather have it off the presidency? Okay. Oh, no, you want it on the Congress. Okay. How about the rest of you? You want it on the Congress? Okay. Leave it like it is. Okay. So balance is that way. All right. Right. All right, so you'd be opposed to the lifelong professional legislator model. Yeah, they did not think of politics at that time as being a career. Yeah, that's right. As a temporary service, that's what they thought at the time, right. And that's why I think we could reason that that's why they didn't impose a constitutional mandate to force you out, right? It was so ingrained in the culture of the time. Yes, sir. Well, that's an interesting question. Let's hold that for a second, because his question was, could you repeat it one time for me, sir? Okay, so legislators that were poor legislators that weren't doing their job wouldn't necessarily get elected. I'll tell you what, hold that thought. We're going to have that debate in just a second, all right? That's good. No, I like where you're going with this. That's great. I do think it's interesting, though, because, you know, if you look at the presidents we've had in the last 20, 30 years, Reagan would have had a third term, in my view, right? George H.W. Bush won that third. That was Reagan's third term. Would Bill Clinton have had a third term? I don't know, you know. Yeah, you see what I mean? You can get into scenarios where you could have a president for 4 or 5 terms, really, you know. The question was, did Congress self-impose term limits originally? Not in any formal way. They didn't want to mandate that. No, it was embedded in the culture, though, in this concept of rotation. But no, they didn't formally do that at all. So that's why I say the limit on the presidency was a real change in that culture, because FDR was the first person that, you know, really achieved that. But right.
Did most of the senators and representatives only serve a limited number of terms and then go back?
Yes, they rotated out quite frequently. Now, well, not until this century, really, because this is the thing. It's the era of incumbency in the 20th century that really changes that. But there were a few people, Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, a few people in that era debated the idea of a constitutionally mandated limit, but it really didn't go very far, okay? Yes? Right. Is it related to the power of committee chairman in terms of wanting to stay longer? That might be part of it. You know what I might suggest, though? It might be a far more fundamental change in our view of government and its role in our society. Because remember, in the 1800s, most people are not viewing the government as a, say, primary provider of services and so on. Most people are somewhat afraid of government. This is another reason why people tended to leave early. I mean, they were afraid of it. They didn't really enjoy it. So, you know, it's an interesting change in mindset, really. Okay, let's look at the Supreme Court case. So we looked at some of the history of it. How about the current state of the law? Well, this case is U.S. Term Limits, Inc., the advocacy organization for term limits, versus Thornton. And this is Arkansas legislator, Mr. Thornton, you see here. And Arkansas, through an amendment, Amendment 73, if I remember right, had instituted a term limit on their congressional delegation. Well, someone took him to court, and notice the dates here that from 91 to 94, 22 states, and then I think eventually a 23rd got added to this, put in actual congressional term limits for their representatives. And the case was decided in 95. Notice it's a 5-4 decision in which the court said you could not impose additional qualifications to the constitutionally enumerated ones regarding term limits. So, interesting case. I actually listened to part of the oral argument before I came over today, and you can do that through the website for the Supreme Court and some others. You know, interesting debate that they have on that. So a very closely divided case, because I think it represents the question of federalism between, does the states have the right to impose an additional qualification, or is that a federal mandate? And on the federal side, where this leftist was then, of course, you now need a constitutional amendment to provide for a congressional term limit. You can't do that, or you could, if you could get Congress, 2/3 of Congress to pass that. And then how many states would I need to pass a constitutional amendment? How many? 2/3. No, I'm sorry, 3/4 to ratify. Right. You need 2/3 to pass the amendment and 3/4 to ratify. Okay? Okay, so let's go on to the case for term limits and the case against it. Now, the first point I make here is that, you know what, and you kind of highlighted this already, guys, a lot of people support term limits. Around 75% of the public in a lot of polling support term limits. Another argument is that, you know what, they say the power and advantages of incumbency are too great, okay? And if you've ever run for office, how many of you, or anybody actually ever run for office here? Okay. Ever ran against an incumbent or been an incumbent? Okay. There are some advantages. There's also some disadvantages too, depends. But generally, there are advantages. Now, what would you think are some of the advantages of incumbency? Familiarity, big time, right? Name identification. What else? The ability to raise money, you're right, fundraising, very big deal. And so this is why incumbents tend to get reelected at a pretty high clip, really. So those that are arguing for term limits say, you know, this is a problem because it kind of promotes a permanent class, professional class that's always there, and that they lose touch with the people and what the people want. And so populists tend to emphasize this. Another point here, the problem of perceived corruption. Now, I say perceived because unless you get an actual court case and prosecution, you know, people like to generally talk about corruption, but there's a couple different senses of that term. I'm curious, though, how many of you think that the issue of incumbency is a problem? Anybody want to volunteer? You think that's a problem? Okay. This article here, if you go one more, is actually the website for the advocacy group U.S. Term Limits. So for those of you that tend to be in favor of term limits, this would be a website you might want to take a look at. Now, while that's up there, I want to read their little paragraph here, because it is interesting the argument they make here for term limits. They say Congress has a 13% approval rating, but a 95% reelection rate. It's good to be an incumbent, right? That's because our elected leaders can abuse their power to keep away challengers, which transfers power from citizens and into the hands of unaccountable career politicians. Sign our petition to impose term limits on Congress. Okay, so here's my question for you. As you read that, Congress has a 13% approval rating. Well, what is Congress? I mean, I hear these statistics, right? These are popular. Congress has 11% rating, 9. Congress, ladies and gentlemen, is an abstraction. There's 435 members of the House, for example, 100 of the Senate. I think a better way to look at that is what's the approval rating of your congressman. That gives you a more accurate idea of that. Go ahead.
There's some studies out there that say that people who disapprove of Congress as a whole approve of their representative personally. I mean, does that contradict what you're saying?
Yeah, so what I'm getting at is that, yeah, that's what's interesting. So what they're really saying is we like our guy, but we're just angry at the amorphous kind of abstraction. Now, where I'm headed with this eventually is, well, who do we blame for that? Well, we blame James Madison, right? And a few other people who set it up with a lot of checks and balances. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so we'll get to that, all right? All right, let's go back to let's look at the case against term limits. And these folks will say, hey, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We've already got term limits. They're called elections. Get involved, right? That would be their argument. Now, of course, the counter from the other side was, well, wait, 95% of incumbents gets reelected. So apparently that hill is pretty steep. The next one, they might say, the anti-democratic nature of arbitrary limits. In other words, don't we as a people have the right to vote for who we want? And if I want to run for an office for a third term, isn't that my right, freedom of speech, to advocate for my politics? So that would be one potential argument against term limits. How about the loss of expertise and experience of lawmakers? Now that's what I posed earlier, right? To suggest that's really valuable. You know, it's important to know how to run the government. This would be an argument that these folks would make. There's no substitute for experience and expertise. And then finally, the transfer of power to those who will now have that expertise: bureaucrats, staff, and lobbyists. And this is an interesting thing to think about, right? So for those of you that are in favor of term limits, in part maybe because of the aggregated power and abuse of that power by long-term incumbents, if you have people coming in and out, who are they going to rely on? Staff, bureaucracy, and I would argue that might even increase their reliance on lobbyists, the K Street crowd, right? It's interesting to think about, really. You know, it's funny, as I started studying this when Kate mentioned up, it's getting harder to figure out which side I'm on. You know, I kind of lean one way, but it's interesting to look at the different arguments for each side. Okay, so I say term limit, solution, or symptom, political dysfunction in Washington. Now, do you think, again, that the term limits as a solution would lessen the dysfunction in Washington? How many of you think that? What do you think? You think it wouldn't limit it? Okay. You think it might a little bit? Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, because what we'd have to do is accurately assess what the causes are for that political dysfunction in Washington, right? So let's look at a few things here. I'm going to argue, ladies and gentlemen, that part of the issue that we have to grapple with, and nobody really wants to, is that our system is designed by the framers to not get things done. Okay, were you aware of this? All right, now this frustrates us a great deal, particularly when we see issues that should seem obvious, maybe like it's not a good idea to be $20 trillion in debt and mounting. All right, but it's set up, the system is, so that unless you can get a sufficient majority to pass legislation, there are checks and balances there to prevent it. It's just the way the system is structured, and we can't forget that, okay? So it's just a reality I like to highlight. Now, the second issue I want to put forward as part of the problem, certainly not all of the problem, is gerrymandering, okay? Now, I know when Dr. Larimer was here, I think in November, he highlighted a good point on this, that you know, right now, for example, the Senate's very partisan and in some ways dysfunctional. That's not gerrymandered, right? They cover the whole state. But yet, I think it is an issue because in the House, the districts have become so gerrymandered that they promote excessive partisanship because they are not in competitive districts. Okay, when that's how you get a 95% reelection rate. You know how most people vote? I don't know about you. It's simply on party identification. You know, they pull the lever for R or D, and that's about it. Now you can tell I'm dating myself because I use the analogy of pulling the lever. We don't do that anymore for you young folks, but you know, I think it's still a relevant issue because when you don't have competitive elections, you just tack to the hard edge of your base. And that's happening more and more in our politics, in my view, on both sides, both political parties. Now, the article I've put up here, yeah, is this, okay, this was the one, this is just recent, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if you heard about this. This is the case in Pennsylvania. I mean, typically, the party in power has the ability to redraw the boundary lines after the census. But apparently, some of them are so excessive, and I'm going to show you a couple of them here, okay, that the court's gotten involved. So, actually, it's the next PowerPoint slide, if you want to go back to that. But check that article out if you like. It's an interesting case in Pennsylvania where the court has said, you got to go back and redraw those lines. They're too partisan. They're just out of line. Here's North Carolina. What do you think? Do those look fairly gerrymandered? Oh, by the way, let me explain the original gerrymander. Go back, if you would, Kate, to my prior slide. This is the diagram named after Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. And it looked kind of like a salamander. And so they started calling it gerrymandering. And That was kind of the illustration that they used for that. All designed, remember, what's a gerrymander designed to do? Keep your party in power. You draw the lines to keep your people in and the opposite party out. Okay, so let's look at North Carolina. Fairly gerrymandered, ladies and gentlemen. Pennsylvania is just as bad if you go to the next one. Check that out. See, that's why the court intervened and said, look, that's too much, all right? So it'll be interesting to see how that case actually works out. Now again, my argument here is that this promotes excessive partisanship in the House, which becomes, again, kind of the breeding ground for people that run for Senate. It's not the whole issue. In fact, if we go to the next one, or I'll show you this first. Iowa really stands out as the exemplar or the gold standard in how you draw lines after a census, okay? Does anybody know why this looks like this and who does the drawing? Yeah. Exactly, thank you. The Legislative Service Agency down in Des Moines on a nonpartisan basis draws these lines. And they do the best they can in terms of population. Now, we've still got, you know, some areas of the state are redder than others, some are bluer than others, but districts 1 and 3 are going to be very competitive this cycle, all right? Steve King, of course, is in 4, tends to be more conservative, and then Dave Loebsbach in the 2nd tends to be a little more liberal, even though that's more balanced, I would argue, than the 4th. I'm not quite sure what happened with the 4th district in this last realignment, but okay. Political polarization, right? The map you see here is actually the New York Times congressional or county map for how counties voted in 2016. Red's the Republicans, blue are the Democrats. So you can see how those patterns kind of develop a certain polarization. Now I'm going to list off just a few reasons here. You may agree or disagree as to why we're becoming so polarized, right? The idea of multiculturalism, this comes more from the political left, and the idea of group identity and perhaps a lack of assimilation into a broader American kind of identity. Media fragmentation, what do you think? You think I'm accurate on that one? Huh? I'm not going to blame the media for everything tonight, but there's certainly been a tremendous fragmentation in the media, right? How about social media? Any of you on social media? Yeah? That gets pretty interesting, right? And then how about a loss of reading skills? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to argue that part of the issue, I think, with political polarization is that people aren't reading anymore. And so they don't have the ability to think as well around an argument. Okay, like should we have term limits or not? Notice I've already put out several articles that I've read for you. You know, if you can't read, you can't analyze, you can't form arguments. And whether it's young people or anyone else in the society, I'm noticing a tremendous loss in people's ability and willingness to read books and articles and so on. So I think it can lead to a certain kind of anti-intellectualism. So now what do? You go home and you watch TV, okay? And you pick your favorite cable channel and you just absorb it. You think I'm right or wrong? Okay? And I think that is leading to some really intellectually lazy people, okay? And that's, I guess my argument here, ladies and gentlemen, is that's not good for a republic. A republic depends on a virtuous citizenry that's actively engaged. So I think I got one more here. Oh yeah, lack of trust in institutions. There's been some research on this that's come out this week, in fact, that shows dramatic losses in confidence in institutions. And of course, some of our politicians have gotten very good at attacking institutions, whether the press, the judiciary, the FBI, of course, is in the news a lot. So a lack of trust there is not helpful, in my view. So my question here is, oh, this is an article regarding that. You don't have to go to that one at this point. Do you think term limits will solve any of those issues, or do you think I'm wrong about some of those underlying issues driving polarization? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah, they're up for a re-election every 2 years, but mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and that's an interesting point you make because that's right. So if you only have a 2-year term, you spend half your time raising money to run for re-election, right? I was recently elected to the Clear Lake City Council. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. So I've kind of dipped my own toe in the political realm here. And ours are a 4-year term, and I'm like, that's terrific because I don't want to run for office again for a while. You know what I mean? It's a lot of time and effort, and for these folks, a lot of time raising money. And yeah, yeah. But see, then you, in that scenario, you'd be extending the term from 2 to 4 years, and you know that would be an even different scenario. The House was designed to be closer to the people, and that's why that term is actually shorter. So I think so again, I'll leave it up to you. I'm not going to solve this debate tonight as to whether term limits in and of themselves would solve some of this political dysfunction. Maybe it would help, maybe it would not. I think one key thing we need to think about, though, and that is this whole idea in our last slide of just the whole notion of civic virtue, okay? The whole idea that in a republic, we all have to have a commitment to the common good ahead of private passion or private concern. This was the fundamental idea that George Washington and the founders all believed in, that to sustain a republic, to not break down into destructive factions, you had to have a fundamental commitment to the common good. And one of the problems I see that term limits would not solve is that if we lose this kind of commitment to a common truth, a common good, and public policies that can address that, then I think we're in dangerous territory. So that's just a thought I had. Like I said, I won't solve the term limit debate for you, but anyway, it's been a pleasure to be here this evening. Is there any questions that I can answer at this point about anything we've talked about? You're all going to run for office next time? Is that right? Yeah, sure. Right. At this point, after the Thornton decision to enact term limits now, you would need a constitutional amendment to do that. And there is a movement to do that. Well, a couple ways you can do that. One, you could have a 2/3 of Congress vote that process to get it started, or 2/3 of the state legislatures or conventions. So right now, the focus of some of the pro-term limits crowd is to focus on the state conventions, okay, to organize those. And I forget exactly how many states have already voted onto that. It's up to double digits, I think, in terms of that number. But right now you need a constitutional amendment. Unless, I mean, perhaps the Supreme Court could reverse on the Thornton decision. I suppose that could happen as well, but that's right. It puts it in the state's hands, right. Other thoughts or comments or questions? Are you getting tired of your politicians? You want some new ones, huh? Well, again, here's my thought. Everybody needs to get involved on which side of the aisle you're on, you know, to be involved in politics. I think that's important to kind of care about your community and how the process is going. So again, thank you all. It's been a pleasure for me to be here tonight.
Another round of applause. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm not sure how many of you have received the news, but this is the last event that I am coordinating for Cedar Talks. I've taken a new position in Des Moines. I'll be closer to some family and friends there. But I just want to let you know that this has been a joy, really, to organize and to coordinate. Thank you for coming regularly and for giving feedback, and I have a list of topics if anyone wants to take this over. I can get you a Facebook group and a list of topics right off the bat. I think you've really exemplified this topic of civic virtue, which is just kind of convenient that you ended on this, because an event like this, you know, this was inspired just by the need to educate people and to remind them about what civic engagement means and what is beyond the news headlines. That might be a weird thing to hear coming from a reporter, but there's so much just beyond the headlines. Please read the rest of the article. But I hope you can continue this spirit. I hope you can continue this curiosity and this care for our state, federal and county or city government. And I would love to see, even if, I'd love to see Cedar Talks continue if someone wanted to take this on, but even more so, I'd love to see the idea and the spirit behind Cedar Talks continue in Charles City. So again, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for coming monthly and for being dedicated. Have a good evening.